Hi, I'm Glenn Greenwald with The Intercept, and I am extremely excited to be here with someone who, in my view, has become one of the most important authors in the world, Johann Hari, who is here in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He has written two of the most innovative, influential, and important books in the last several years, the first of which is called Chasing the Scream, about addiction in the drug war, and the second of which was released earlier this year called Lost Connections, exploring some of our assumptions about depression and the causes of it. And Johann is here in Brazil in part because his book, his first book about addiction, has been released in Portuguese, and debates over the drug war are at the forefront of the political discussions of most countries in the world, and certainly here in Brazil, where Brazilians recently elected a president, Jair Bolsonaro, in large part based on promises to make the drug war much more violent and much more aggressive, which convinced a lot of people that he would be actually able to persuade it. And Johann's book is directly relevant to the discussion taking place here in Brazil, but also all over the world, about all of those issues and many more, which we're going to explore. So Johann, first of all, thank you for taking time out of your very busy Brazil schedule to talk to me.
I'm very excited. I feel like you and I have in fact died and we are in heaven, because it feels like we're floating in this white space. So it has a slightly dreamlike quality.
So your first book, Chasing the Scream, about addiction, was not only a book widely read in multiple languages around the world, but it also generated a TED Talk that became one of the most viral TED Talks in the history of TED Talks. I don't know how many people have seen it, but it's many, many millions on YouTube and on the TED Talk website. And the tagline of the book and of the talk, that to this day, when I think about, still provokes a lot of thought within me, became "Everything that you think you know about addiction is wrong." And the kind of explanation for that, the soundbite for it, became the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, which obviously is the word most people think of as the opposite of addiction. Instead, you said, the opposite of addiction is connection. Talk about what that means. Why is the opposite of addiction not sobriety, but instead connection?
Yeah, I kind of came to that insight in quite a hard way, I think. So one of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. I didn't understand why then, but as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family. And by the time I started doing the research for Chasing the Scream, which must be about 8 years ago now, some of the people I love were in a really bad state, and I was trying to figure out what to do, so I ended up going and traveling and speaking to people with very different approaches all over the world. And I think this is, you've come to one of the things that most kind of surprised me in what I learned. So I thought I had a fairly clear story about what I'd seen happen in front of me with the people I loved. So we've been told this story about addiction for 100 years that's totally become part of our common sense. It definitely was part of mine. We think if we grab the next 20 people off the street who walk past this studio, and we injected them all with heroin every day for a month like a villain in a Saw movie, at the end of that month, they'd all be addicted to heroin for a simple reason that there are chemical hooks in heroin and all other drugs that their bodies would start to desperately physically need. At the end of the month, they'd have this terrible physical craving for these hooks, and that's what addiction is, right? That's why we call it being hooked. That story isn't false, but it's a relatively small part of what's going on in addiction. And one of the ways we know this is because of a breakthrough that happened in the 1970s by this amazing man I got to know in Vancouver called Professor Bruce Alexander. So he explained to me the story we have, that addiction is caused just by the chemical hooks, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. We could do them here in this weird heaven-like set if we wanted to, if we were feeling a bit sadistic. They're really simple experiments. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. It takes a couple of weeks usually. So there you go, right? That's our story. But in the
so that's the conventional story. So you have a rat, you enable it to ingest a substance we regard as addictive, heroin or cocaine or some other substance, and then the rat just continually goes back to that substance, even though that substance will eventually harm the rat or even kill it. That's the conventional story of addiction that we've all been taught to believe. So what did this
And
experiment debunk about this?
Well, you remember that in the 80s, there was a famous Partnership for Drug-Free America advert at the height of the Nancy Reagan Just Say No stuff, which depicted that experiment. But it had already been shown a decade before that there was a crucial flaw in these experiments and in that theory of addiction, right? So Professor Alexander in the 70s was working with people with addiction problems, and he started to think this theory couldn't be quite right. So he went back to look at these early experiments, and he was like, hang on a minute, you put the rat alone in an empty cage where it's got nothing that makes life meaningful for rats. So he asked, what would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically like heaven for rats. They've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, they've got loads of cheese. Actually, it's not cheese, it's grain. Apparently, it's a bit of a myth that rats like cheese. They've got loads of coloured balls. Everything that makes life meaningful for rats is there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. And of course, they try both. They don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water very much. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So they go from almost 100% compulsive use and fatal overdose when they don't have the things that make life meaningful, to none when they do have the things that make life meaningful. Now, there's loads of human examples of this. I think the opioid crisis is a really powerful, devastating opioid crisis playing out in the US is a really powerful illustration of this. But this shows that the core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be.
And what is it about that realization? And that explains the idea that the opposite of addiction is connection, because if you connect to other people, the way the rats did, or to some fulfillment, then it displaces the motivation or the impulse to seek out drugs addictively. What is it about that experiment and that realization that means that most of what we know about addiction or think about addiction is wrong?
So I think there's a whole range of things, and there's lots of human evidence about this. And I think one of the best ways to explain it is by looking at a place that built its drug policies around Rat Park and the insights that come from Rat Park. So up to now, for nearly 100 years now, almost everywhere in the world has built its drug policies when it comes to addiction around the idea of punishment, right? It's the idea that, people who've got addiction problems need to have pain inflicted on them to give them an incentive to stop, right? And I went to places that had totally built their drug. I mean, in Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to come out on a chain gang wearing T-shirts saying I was a drug addict, while members of the public mock them and jeer at them. We know the results, right? Those women leave prison not less addicted, but more addicted because they're even more traumatized.
Because they have more internal pain and therefore a greater need or desire for the drugs that anesthetize that pain.
I think the core lesson, not just for Brazil, but for the whole world, is, the operation he sent in to attack and brutalize the people with very chaotic street addictions was called Operation Pain and Suffering, right? Now, what we know from all the best evidence is that pain and suffering are the causes of addiction. So you can see, once you understand that, why this war on drugs approach, sometimes people say, oh, it doesn't work, right? That massively understates it. It makes the problem worse, right? It's not the cause of the problem, but it makes the problem worse. And I think one of the ways we can understand what a tragic wasted opportunity this is if we can look at the countries that I went to that actually, like we were saying, built their drug policies around the insights that come from Rat Park. So I give you two examples, Portugal and Switzerland, but just talk about Portugal first. Actually, I think Switzerland holds the real answer to the opioid crisis, but in terms of Portugal, Portugal by the year 2000 had one of the worst drug crises in the whole world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin. And they had areas in Lisbon, in Porto, that looked like Cracolandia.
Where
right?
people were just in the streets by the hundreds, if not the thousands, living homeless and just constantly with needles on their arms.
Yeah, and chaotic, completely chaotic street, people injecting in the neck in public, really disturbing.
Tons of, and drug-related pathologies as well, like sexually transmitted diseases, crime related to that addiction, drug overdosage, the whole kind of panoply of pathologies was really plaguing Portugal in the 1990s as they implemented this kind of punishment scheme.
Exactly, and every year the problem got worse, and every year they tried the American drug war, as you know from doing brilliant work in Portugal yourself, more and more the American approach, punishment, shame, imprisonment, right? And this situation kept deteriorating. And one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they decided to do something really radical, something no one had done in global drug policy for 70 years. They said, should we like ask some scientists what we should do? So they set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by an amazing man who I think you met, and I got to know Dr. João Goulão, who's an incredible person. And they said to this panel, it was social workers, judges, and doctors, no politicians. And they said, you guys go away, figure out what would genuinely solve this problem, and we've agreed in advance, all the main political parties will do whatever you recommend. So they go away, they look at the evidence, Rat Park is a key part of it, but lots of other things as well. And they come back and they say, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack, everything. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we currently spend on screwing people's lives up, shaming them, punishing them, arresting them.
Prosecuting them, arresting them.
Incredibly, as you know from your legal work, incredibly expensive to do, right? Take all that money and spend it instead on turning people's lives around. And interestingly, it's not really what we think of as drug treatment in the kind of Anglo-American world. There's some residential rehab and that has real value. Most of it was environmental intervention, right? Getting people housing. Say you used to be a mechanic. They'll go to a garage, they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. It's still much cheaper than the drug war approach. The goal was to say to everyone with an addiction problem in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, right? And by the time I went to Portugal, it was, I think you were there a bit before me, because I remember you giving me some advice about it. So you were there 12 years after, I was there 13 years after, I think this had begun. The results were very clear. The best study of this is in the British Journal of Criminology. Addiction was down by more than 50%. Overdose deaths were enormously down. HIV transmission was enormously down. Crime was massively down. And one of the ways you know it succeeded so well is virtually nobody in Portugal wants to go back. I went and interviewed a guy called João Figueira, who was the top drug cop in Portugal at the time of the decriminalisation. And he led the opposition to it, right? He said, this is, understandably, he said this could be a disaster. We're going to have loads of kids using drugs. We're going to have an explosion in drug use. He said to me, everything I said would happen did not happen.
They said Lisbon would turn into a tourist haven for drugs. None of it happened. And
in fact, lots of great things happened. It wasn't just the absence of the bad stuff.
And I should note, too, the interesting thing, when I was there actually in 2007 doing the research, and one of the things that they were actually upset about, one of the only things they were upset about was when they told this commission, go away and study all of the options. The one option they told them they were not permitted to consider was legalization as opposed to decriminalization, because the US had been threatening them that if they were to legalize drugs, they would be held in, essentially they would be judged to be in violation of various conventions and treaties, and as a small country, Portugal actually has to abide by international conventions and treaties, so they were barred from considering full-on legalization. But decriminalization, as you say, didn't just get rid of the problem, it improved the relationship of the population to the government, which they no longer viewed as the people threatening them, but the people trying to help them. It gave people purpose and the like. Just
worth explaining the difference between decriminalization and legalization. A lot of people don't know that difference. So decriminalization is where you stop punishing users, but they still have to go to armed criminal gangs to get
Which
their
is
drug.
what the US demanded. If you want to tell Portuguese citizens they don't go to prison for usage or consumption or for purchase, fine. You're still required, though, to have the drug trade be criminalized and to continue to interdict drug trades and to put drug lords or large-scale dealers into prison.
Exactly. So legalization is where you open up some legal route for the user to get their drug. And it's important to say that means different things for different drugs, right? In the same way, you know, I live half the year in London. In London, it is legal to own a dog, a monkey, and a lion. But the rules are different, right? I can just go and buy a dog in a store. A monkey, I think I need a license. A lion, they come in and like inspect my house and make sure I'm not a mad person. In the same way, different countries have legalized drugs in different ways. So for example, in Colorado and Washington, I report a lot in Chasing the Scream on where they legalized cannabis. We know how incredibly successful that's been. Huge increase not only in tax revenues, decline in children using drugs, slight decline, but a real one, and a big increase in support. But Switzerland, for example, legalized heroin. Now that they legalized it in a very different way. There isn't like a heroin aisle in the Swiss equivalent to CVS. I can explain how that works if you want, because I think it's the core to understanding the solution to the opioid crisis, which I think really the opioid crisis is being profoundly misunderstood in the US. But yeah, so decriminalization is a great first step. Stopping the punishment of users is a huge thing, but the way I often phrase it is decriminalization shuts down Orange is the New Black and legalization shuts down Breaking Bad. And Breaking Bad, to me, the violence caused by the war on drugs is the biggest tragedy, although what we do to people with addiction problems is very close to
before
my
we move
heart.
on to the macro policy options, which I want to talk about both in general and in the context of Brazil, I just want to stay a little bit on the kind of human, emotional, psychological, spiritual elements of your book and the conclusions of these experiments. And I want to talk about it specifically in the context of the opioid crisis in the United States, because it has become a remarkably destructive epidemic. In 2017, more Americans were killed through opioid abuse or overdose than were killed during the entire Vietnam War. More Americans were killed in 2017 through opioid use than were killed by HIV at the height of the AIDS epidemic, just to kind of set the magnitude for. And obviously it's leading to a lot of different discussions about who the villains are, what the causes are, what the solutions are. As you know, I recently got into a kind of discussion and debate online with people who live in one of the regions, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, most affected by the opioid epidemic, although there are lots of other places equally affected. Because I've been doing work with homeless addicts here in Brazil, and the project is designed to kind of give them this connection that you've been talking about as a way of treating addiction by tapping into the love they have for animals, as demonstrated by the care they display for them on the streets, by creating shelters where they can work with animals, so they're simultaneously doing what they love most, which is taking care of animals, and at the same time finding a way off the street because they're getting paid and learning how to open bank accounts and stabilize their life. And so my argument was, hey, one of the causes of the opioid addiction, as is true for addiction generally, is this lack of connection, this lack of spirituality, this lack of purpose. And here's a video where people have rediscovered life purpose by rescuing animals in need and running shelters. And a lot of people are very angry about this, suggesting that if you phrase it the way that you phrase it, which is a cause of addiction is lack of connection, you're doing two things. Number one, you're blaming the addict by accusing the addict of having some kind of flaw or defect, a lack of connection, a lack of spirituality, and you're letting off the hook capitalism, societal deprivation, in the case of the opioid industry, the pharmaceutical industry that has flooded the country with opioids and has profited off people's pain and suffering. What's your view on that kind of binary way of looking at it, that either we blame capitalism and the pharmaceutical industry, or we look to the addict and see what is it about the addict that is causing the addiction?
So this is really important, and this is really the subject of my book, Lost Connections, which is about...
Which is the book you released this year about depression.
Yeah, it's about why we're having this epidemic of despair across the Western world, right? And I think you have to understand the opioid crisis in the context of this, average white male life expectancy has fallen in the United States for the first time in the entire peacetime history of the existence of the Republic, overwhelmingly because of two things, opioid overdoses and suicide. And it's not a coincidence, those two things are at their peak in exactly the same places.
How are those related? How are addiction or opioid addiction and suicide related?
So everyone knows that they've got natural physical needs, right? Obviously you need food, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in terrible trouble really quickly. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And this culture we've built, which is largely the product of neoliberal capitalism, does not meet those psychological needs very well for extremely large numbers of people. Let's think about West Virginia, right? And it's important to say the people that you were arguing with, the story they have in their heads about why this has happened to them is not wrong. The pharmaceutical companies have behaved monstrously. It's one part of the picture. So just look at the pharmaceutical industries first. It's absolutely true that chemical hooks are real. And it's true that the pharmaceutical companies missold these drugs. They claimed that there was no risk of addiction. That's ludicrous for anything. I mean, gambling doesn't contain any chemical
Similar
hooks.
to the way tobacco companies denied the addictive properties of their products for a long
Exactly.
time.
And tobacco is a really good one to look at because there's a very strong scientific agreement that tobacco contains some of the highest, strongest chemical hooks that humans have. In that if you smoke tobacco for a while and then you stop, you really will feel an intense physical longing, right? We know what the chemical hook inside tobacco is, it's nicotine. And if you go back to debate in the late 80s, when nicotine patches are first invented, there's this huge wave of optimism among scientists because they believe addiction is caused by chemical hooks. Now we can give smokers all the chemical hook they're addicted
Without
to.
the harm.
Exactly, without all this filthy carcinogenic smoke, everyone's going to stop smoking. And the best study by the US Surgeon General's report found that motivated smokers given nicotine patches will stop smoking in 17% of cases, right? Now, it's important to say 17% is very far from nothing,
But it was
right?
because in 83% of the cases there was something going on besides just the biochemical need for the nicotine.
Exactly, and we all know that. Think about giving up smoking, which loads of people watching this will have done. Are you going to give up smoking the week in which you lose your house, you lose your job, and your husband leaves you? Probably not. You're probably going to give up smoking when your life's going really well. You can see how of course there's a relationship to the chemical hook, but the chemical hook is one small part of it. So those people you're arguing with who are saying, these pharmaceutical companies lied to us, they sold these drugs, that is absolutely true. They're right to despise
What
those
were they
companies.
missing though?
So what they're missing is the best evidence, if you look at the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA, who, a bit of a mixed bag, but they've done some good stuff on this, around 8% of people who take opioid-based painkillers over time develop an addiction, right? 92% don't. Now, let's think about the faculty of Harvard, right? Faculty of Harvard have much better access to opiate-based painkillers than the people of West Virginia on average, because everyone on the faculty of Harvard has health insurance, and unfortunately, a very large number of people in West Virginia don't. And yet, we know, the evidence is very clear, opioid addiction is way higher in West Virginia than it is on the faculty of Harvard, right? If it was just exposure to the chemical hook, that would make no sense. So what's going on? I think about a place that I spent some time, one of the worst epicenter of some of the worst death figures in the United States, Monadnock in New Hampshire. What's happened? People have been absolutely devastated, right? The things that gave their life meaning and purpose have been stripped from them through no fault of their own, right?
Like what things?
Well, the industries that employed them, that gave them meaning, that gave them a sense that they could provide for their families, those are all gone. Think about what happened to West Virginia. Nothing good was brought in its place. But there's a deeper, so in Lost Connections, I go through these 9 causes of this despair epidemic for which there's scientific evidence. I mean, I'll give you an obvious one, loneliness. The United States today is the loneliest society there's ever been. There's a study recently that asked Americans, how many people know you well? And half of Americans surveyed said, nobody, right? We are a social species.
And what's really interesting about that is, I mean, because I've talked a lot, it's interesting because I spent a lot of years, as you know, talking about the value of privacy and the human need for privacy and the kind of impulse and need that we have to be able to have a place in the world that we can go to where nobody sees us, where nobody can recognize or judge us for what we're doing. And yet, paradoxically, or maybe not, but simultaneously, we have the countervailing need, because we're social animals, to be seen, for people to know what it is that we're thinking and doing, which is precisely why people who are put into prolonged solitary confinement are eventually suffer serious mental health problems, and it's regarded now as a form of torture because it deprives a human being of something they desperately need, which is interaction with other human beings.
And John McCain, who neither you nor I are fans of, but he said the worst thing they did to him in those Vietnamese prisoner of war camps wasn't when they tortured him so badly he couldn't ever lift his arms again. It was when they just put him in solitary, right? And
so let me ask you about that, because this idea that loneliness has become its own form of an epidemic, that's particularly true in the United States, it's true elsewhere, it's clearly linked to, at least in some way, the opioid epidemic. One of the bizarre aspects of that is that the dominant technology of the last 2 decades has been the internet. And one of the promises of the internet, the reason it was heralded as this remarkable innovation, when I met Edward Snowden, it's one of the things he emphasized about why he regarded it as so almost sacred that it was worth sacrificing his life to protect, was its capability to provide connection. That I can pick up the phone at any moment and communicate even if I'm in a car by myself, not just with somebody in my own city, but somebody on the other side of the world, that it was going to be this technology that would foster the greatest amount of human connectedness ever known to humanity. And yet at the same time, as this technology proliferates, loneliness, as you just documented, seems to increase, leading to things like a need for drugs to anesthetize that pain. How do you account for that seeming paradox?
So I wanted to understand this. I went to the first ever internet rehab center in the United States. It's in Spokane in Washington State, and just outside Spokane. And it really taught me something. I spent a lot of time with the woman called Dr. Hilary Cash, who set it up and runs it. She's an amazing person. And they get all kinds of people there, but they disproportionately get young men who become obsessed with multiplayer role-play games like World of Warcraft or Fortnite, it would be now, because it didn't exist then. And she said to me, you've got to ask yourself, what are these young men getting out of these games? They're getting the things they used to get from the culture, but they no longer get. They get a sense of tribe. They get a sense of identity. They get a sense they're good at something. They get a sense they can physically move around. The average child now spends less time outdoors than the average maximum security prisoner, because by law, a maximum security prisoner has to have 70 minutes a day. But what they're getting is like I think a parody of connection. As I spoke to a lot of these young men and thought about this more, I began to think the connection between social media and social life is like the connection between porn and sex, right? I'm not against porn, it'll meet a certain basic itch, but no one, after an hour looking at porn, feels satisfied and valued and held the way they do, after they've had sex, if it goes well, right? That we didn't evolve to masturbate over screens, we evolved to actually have sex. And in a similar way, we didn't evolve...
And all of the intimacy and love and connection that comes with it that this simulated version isn't capable of providing and really isn't designed to provide.
Exactly. I think it's too simplistic, and this is not what you're saying, but some people say, oh, the internet did this to us. And I think that's too simplistic for several reasons. Partly because a lot of the causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in Lost Connections were already supercharged before the internet comes along. What happens is the internet arrives and it looks a lot like the things we've lost, right? We've lost friends, but here's some Facebook friends. We lost status, but here's status updates. But it's like all addiction, it's an attempt to fill a hole that doesn't quite work. And I think there's another aspect in which the internet feeds this crisis. So everyone knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? You can tell from my chins. There's equally strong evidence that a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick, and there's good evidence the internet feeds this. So for thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and how you look to other people, you're going to feel like shit, right? That's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that is the gist of what he said, right? But weirdly, no one had scientifically investigated this until an incredible man called Professor Tim Kasser, who I spent some time with interviewing. He's at Knox College in Illinois. And what he showed is two things. Firstly, the more you think life is about showing off and money and status, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious and despairing by a significant amount. But also, as a culture, as a society, we have become much more driven by these things. To that degree, as you and I talk about a lot, Trump is a symptom as much as he is the cause of this, more than he is the cause of these problems, right? So, and I think the internet, this way of thinking that you think about status and showing off, is called extrinsic thinking, right? It's when what you value is something outside meaningful relationships. And the internet massively increases, social media increases its extrinsic thinking. It makes us feel like shit.
So let me ask you, connect this to the broader policy debates taking place around the world, but also specifically here in Brazil, because whatever the causes of addiction might be, and whatever the best ways to think about them might be, and whatever the optimal treatments and solutions are, the reality is that the policies surrounding drugs, whether it's the war on drugs itself or the behavior people engage in because of their addiction, does generate violence in every place where it's found. And here in Brazil, there's an epidemic of violence. 60,000 people in Brazil last year in 2017 were killed. The chances that a Rio de Janeiro city police officer will be murdered tomorrow is greater than the chances that a US soldier will have been killed at the peak of violence in the Iraq War. So violence has really become epidemic here in Brazil. And for me, just personally, living here, looking at data as well, but also anecdotally, I know that a big part of why so many people who are not adherents to a far-right ideology nonetheless voted for a far-right candidate like Jair Bolsonaro was not because of his horrible homophobia or his adoration for dictators or his misogyny. It was despite all of those things. In fact, it was because many of them live in very poor neighborhoods where violence is epidemic, and Bolsonaro's promise was, look, I'm going to put an end to this drug war once and for all. How am I going to do that? I'm going to unleash the police, I'm going to unleash the military, and we're just going to go murder all the drug dealers. Similar to what Duterte has promised with great popularity to do in the Philippines, what Singapore does, what Indonesia does. Just basically, we're going to destroy and kill the people who are responsible for this violence, namely the drug traffickers. And you say to them, well, how are they going to know who the drug dealers are to kill? Isn't it execution or the death penalty without due process? They say, oh no, you see a 16-year-old kid carrying an assault rifle, you know that's a bad person, you kill him. That was a big part of Bolsonaro's appeal. People petrified by violence, scared that when they send their kids to school, they're not going to come back because they're going to be shot by drug dealers. People in wealthy neighborhoods afraid that they're going to be violently assaulted. It seems intuitively appealing, right? Like there's all these people committing violence, and if you kill them all, the violence will stop. If you think that's not a correct way to think, and I believe you think it isn't, talk about some of the most important reasons why that is so misguided.
Yeah, so I think you're right. Brazilians and in the United States through Trump and in many parts of the world, a real problem is being identified. Horrific death toll here in Brazil. I mean, I was just this morning in Maré Favela. People are being murdered there the whole time. And then they're being sold.
And obviously, we should say that as is true in the US, here in Brazil, the people who are killed by the police in shootouts with drug gangs are disproportionately poor, black, male, and young.
Exactly. So people are being sold a false solution, and there's a real solution. But I think to understand the false solution, you have to understand what's going on. So very often in the US, you'll hear in coverage a phrase, drug-related violence, right? And what people picture when they hear that phrase is someone using drugs, going crazy and attacking someone, right? And they begin to think that drug use and violence are inherently connected. Now, it's true, drug use and violence, sometimes people use drugs and go crazy. There's a very good study, this by Professor Paul Goldstein. What he found was 3% of what's called drug-related violence is that. The vast majority.
So what 3% of drug violence is somebody takes PCP or gets high on cocaine or meth, and then either goes to steal money so they can buy more drugs, or their brains are just so distorted by the narcotics that they become unduly violent and commit crime. 3% of drug-related violence.
Or actually, the 3% also includes just people who crash their car. So it's not often as lurid as that.
Right, right. So 3%, which means that 97% of drug-related violence is something other than people consuming drugs and then engaging in violence. What is that other 97%?
So to understand it, I think I'll do a little thought experiment, right? Imagine we were sitting in Chicago and we decided to go and steal a bottle of vodka, right? We go into a liquor store, we steal a bottle of vodka and they catch us. They'll call the police will come and take us away. That liquor store doesn't need to be violent, it doesn't need to be intimidating. They've got the power of the law to uphold their property rights. Okay, so they've got the power of the state to uphold it. Now imagine we were in Chicago and we decided we wanted to steal a bag of weed or a bag of coke or a bag of meth, right? Obviously, the guy who sells that, and I spent a lot of time with people who sell those chasing the scream, they can't ring the police. The police would come and arrest them. They have to fight you. Now, you don't want to be having a fight every day if you're a dealer. You've got to establish a reputation for being such a badass that no one would be so foolish as to take you on, right? You exist because you can exert violence, and you win your place in the marketplace through violent conflict with other potential sellers, right? So the war on drugs creates a war for drugs, as Charles Bowden, the writer, put it. And if you want to understand how much of that is caused by the act of prohibition, by the fact that it's banned, just ask yourself, where are the violent alcohol dealers, right? Everyone knows who Al Capone was.
Right, there was a time when there were violent alcohol dealers. namely when alcohol was illegal.
Exactly.
And then when alcohol was decriminalized and made legal again, the violence disappeared.
That day it ended. I mean, there's a guy at Harvard, Professor Jeffrey Myron, done an amazing graph of the murder rate in the 20th century in the United States. Massively shoots up when alcohol is banned, drops like a stone the day alcohol is legalized. I mean, today, the head of Smirnoff does not go and send teenagers to shoot the head of Budweiser in the face, right? Your local bar does not go and blow up the rival bar. Exactly that kind of violence happened under alcohol prohibition, and it ended the day alcohol prohibition ended, right? So Maria Lucia Caram, who's was a judge here in Brazil, she's retired now, has done very good calculations. I talked to her last time I was in Rio, that 30,000 of the murders here in Brazil every year are the direct result of this war for drugs that can be ended by ending prohibition. That's a staggering, I mean, that's almost beating Mexico. I spent a lot of time in northern Mexico for Chasing the Scream, tell the story in the book of a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel who I spent time with. This astonishing violence, we can end that, right? I mean, by some figures, more people have died here in Latin America in the war for drugs than have died in Syria, right? Now, I don't know what we can do about Syria other than take the refugees. We could end this violence, right? And to me, although...
So let me just ask you, because I think one of the really interesting things, and this will be the last question that I have for you, because I think it sets the frame for the whole debate, is drug legalization, drug decriminalization was, until fairly recently, a rather fringe position, the kind of argument that if you advocated, you were excluded from the mainstream. When Portugal decriminalized in 2000, almost nobody talked about it because it was considered so radical. And in a very short period of time, it's become almost such a mainstream position that nobody bats an eye anymore when you advocate it. In fact, one of the leading proponents of drug legalization is the former center-right, fairly conservative president of Brazil, the two-term president Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who worked with people like Kofi Annan and former presidents of Mexico and other places in South America and Asia, ravaged not by drugs but by the drug war, all of whom have said the war on drugs is a failure, it's time to decriminalize or time to legalize. Everybody has read the same data that you and I have now talked about and wrote about when it comes to the success in Portugal and in Switzerland. There is a trend in lots of places like Europe to treat drug usage and even addiction not as a criminal problem deserving punishment, but as a health problem deserving treatment and counseling. So everybody's starting to understand the policy implications and the statistics. People now know what you and I have been talking about for the last 30 minutes or so, and the journalism we've been doing and the research others like us have been doing. What is the barrier, or what are the barriers to simply implementing the obvious policy that will get rid of the violence, which is decriminalization? Pablo Escobar's son famously said that the only thing his father feared was legalization.
Yeah, I've actually become friends with Pablo Escobar's son. He's kind of amazing, Sebastian, and he said that to me as well. He said, if drugs had been legal, my dad would have been a used car salesman, he said to me, and you would never have heard his name.
So,
right?
yeah. Is that true? Is it that the people who are making so much money from prohibition, namely the drug dealers, the police officers who receive bribes from the drug trade to allow it to go on, the private prisons who fill up people and make profit off of them, are so powerful that they're essentially the ones standing in the way?
No, I think that they have some power and influence, but I think, to be honest, that's a relatively minor part of the picture. I think to understand how we get through this, I think it's worth thinking about Switzerland, right? I'm a Swiss citizen because my dad's from there. Switzerland is a super conservative country. My Swiss relatives make Trump look like Oprah, right? And yet Swiss people voted to keep heroin legal. I think it's worth explaining how. Partly because it tells you the answer to that question, and partly it gives us the answer to the opioid crisis. So I'm putting a lot of weight on this, but I think it bears it.
This is the perfect way to end.
So Switzerland, at the same time Portugal's having its crisis, Switzerland has a horrendous heroin crisis, right? People will remember famous images from the parks in Zurich and in Thun and in Geneva of, you know, just horrendous chaotic street use, right? And again, they try punishment, and again, it's a disaster. And then they get their first female president, one of my complete heroes, a woman called Ruth Dreifuss, astonishing person. And Ruth explained to Swiss people, first as Minister for Health and then as President, when you hear the word legalization, what you picture is anarchy and chaos. What we have now is anarchy and chaos. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown drug users, all in the dark, all filled with violence, disease, and chaos. What she proposed to do was to legalize heroin, and she said to people, that is what will restore order. She actually used a very conservative argument. And it's important to explain what that meant, right? And how it solved Switzerland's opioid crisis. This is a model for what the US should be doing. The US is doing the opposite at the moment, including actually egged on by a lot of well-meaning, nice left liberal people who are our friends, but they're advocating a really disastrous model. So with the system that Ruth set up, with the NGOs and civil society in Switzerland, if you've got a heroin problem, obviously you can't just buy it. You're assigned to a clinic. You go there. I spent time in the one in Geneva. You have to go at 7 o'clock in the morning because Swiss people believe in doing things insanely early. It's a constant disagreement with my dad that I have. You turn up. You're given your heroin there. It's medically pure heroin, not the shit you'd buy on the street. You're given it for free. You use it there. You can't take it out with you. You're watched by a nurse as you use it. And then you leave to go to your job because they give you support to get work. They give you support to get housing. They give you loads of therapy. So they give you two things: the drug you're addicted to in the safest possible form, and loads of support and help to deal with the reasons why you're using this drug. And one of the things, it's important to say the kind of overall figures, which is since they did this in Switzerland, started doing it 16 years ago, there have been 0 heroin overdose deaths on the legal program, not a single person. And there's been an enormous fall in heroin overdose deaths outside the legal program as people transfer into it. But it's important to, and Swiss people had a referendum on this after it had been in place. And 70% of Swiss people voted to keep it legal. Not because they're so compassionate, they're not. It just led to a massive fall in crime. But the most important thing to understand about that in relation to the opioid crisis is, what do they do, right? They give you the drug, they give you the support to deal with the reasons why you're addicted. And one of the things that surprised me there was, if you're in that program, you can stay on that program as long as you want. There is never any pressure to cut back. There's no pressure even to cut your dose, reduce your dose. And yet almost everyone on that program does reduce their dose over time and stop. And I remember there was almost nobody when I was there who had been on it at the start. I think it was 1 or 2 guys, right? And I remember saying to the psychiatrist who ran the program, well, she's called Rita Mangi. So why is that? Because we're told the drug takes you over, you need more and more of it. Surely if you had an infinite free supply, you would just take it infinitely. And she said to me, well, their lives get better. And as their lives get better because we support them, they don't want to be anesthetized so much, which sounds so obvious. Just to think about that in relation to the opioid crisis. So as I say, what Switzerland does is give you the drug, give you massive amount of support until you no longer want the drug. What the US is doing is the exact opposite. Take away the drug. If you are addicted to OxyContin or one of the other opioid-based painkillers, and your doctor figures out you're taking it not for pain relief, but because you're addicted, that doctor is legally obliged to cut you off.
Which then puts people into heroin.
Of course, they go to the street and they start using street heroin because that's the only thing you can buy on the street at an affordable price. Firstly, they cut off the supply. Then, far from giving people support to turn their lives around, we criminalize them and put barriers between them and getting back to a normal life. So what we need to do is follow the Swiss model, which is a safe legal route in a contained, safe environment, not just, of course, a free-for-all. That's the opposite of what we want. And massive support Professor Bruce Alexander, who did the Rat Park experiment, says, we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery. That has real value. But we need to talk much more about social recovery.
And I think just to close, I think one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you so much for an international audience beyond just the kind of country by country visits that you're doing, for our international readers for The Intercept and also our Brazilian readers at The Intercept Brazil, is precisely because of that. Because we often talk about addiction and the war on drugs on this kind of macro policy level of statistics and research and data, which is important. And we talk very little about the human component of what is it that's causing widespread depression, and what is it that's causing people to seek out these drugs and to be so vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. And I think your 2 books, the first about addiction, the second about depression, are the perfect companion books for thinking about this in a much more holistic way. So we can obviously talk about this forever. It's an incredibly fascinating and also multifaceted problem, because and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you. But I hope the point that people walk away from this discussion with, aside from the need to read your books, is that there are other components to this discussion besides clinical, statistical, policy ones that need attention.
I think you're right, and I think this connects to something else you and I talk about a lot, which is this addiction crisis, this depression crisis, this rise of political extremism across the world, whether it's Trump or Brexit or Bolsonaro. These are signals, right? They are telling us something really important. They're telling us we've built a society where people's basic psychological needs are not being met. And what too many people are doing is pathologizing these signals. They're saying, oh, addiction is just due to the drug, depression is just due to a chemical imbalance in your brain. Of course, there are real biological aspects. Trump is just about racism. Of course, there is some aspect that's about racism. And what that does is it stops us hearing the signal, right? It stops us hearing what's gone wrong. And it's only when we begin to hear the signal of terrible distress that people are sending us, sometimes in chaotic and unhelpful ways, for sure. I'm not in favor of crack use. I'm not in favor of Trump. But if we don't listen sympathetically to that and hear that signal, we will never find our way out of this. But these signals are pointing us in a direction where if we listen to them, we can actually begin to solve these problems.
Johan, that's the reason why I find your book so worthy of discussion, and why I'm so happy that we were able to find the time to have this discussion. Correct. So thank you so much.
Exactly.